a discussion panel is what will follow, and I'm very glad that for this discussion panel, which is entitled, as you've seen, Horizon 2025, towards a better application of the succession regulation, we can count on 4 panelists, which I will introduce first, and then I will give the word to them, the floor to them, to let them intervene. Starting on my left-hand side, we have Octavian ROGOJANU, who is a notary in Romania, but who is also the president of the European Network of Registers of Wills Association. Thank you very much for being here. SCHALL, who is a notary in Germany and who many of you know also because of his previous capacity here in Brussels and who has been an active member of the MAPE project. Mrs. Šárka, also an active member of our project and a notary in the Czech Republic. And last but not least, we have Andreas STEIN, who's the head of the unit Civil Justice at the European Commission and who will then, with his team, be in charge of preparing and leading the recast in a number of years. I will first give the floor to Octavian, and maybe ask you, Octavian, as you've heard, there are many recommendations, 18 recommendations, and 2 of them focus specifically on registers. There's recommendation number 6, which is quite innovative because it suggests that member states should create new registers in which the opening of succession proceedings would be recorded. And then we have succession number 15 on something which exists in some member states, registers for the European Certificate of Succession. As you are expert on register and on interconnection of national registers, Octavian, may I ask you to comment as you wish on these 2 recommendations?
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, thank you for inviting me. So I'll start with the last one, the 15th one, because our main goal is to insist on creating ECS registers on national level. Because we say it's better from practical point of view to have more interconnected registers of ECS than to build a new one, completely new one of, let's say, where you have mentioned the starting of the succession procedure. Why do we say so? Because we already have a network, it's working, and I think, well, we have a good technological platform, innovative, and probably this is the future, not building something new, using something which we already have, which will cost less money. And I think it's the moment that the European Commission should somehow not impose, but let's say strongly recommend to the member states to establish a national register of ECS. Then we can interconnect them, and then the practitioners can see if there was another ECS issued, and they can somehow check, and let's say as a result, they will avoid double procedures, because this is one of the issues which you already mentioned, and I think it's important to avoid that.
Thank you. May I follow up immediately with a question on that interconnection, unity in diversity or diversity in unity? We know that ECS are not issued in every member state by notaries. In some member states, they're issued by courts or maybe other officials.
Correct.
What type of challenge would this give rise to in terms of interconnecting registers which are administered at the national level by different type of bodies or authorities?
Of course. Well, of course, we have countries, let's say Germany, where the ECS is not issued by the notary, but not only Germany, of course. Well, I will come back with my appeal to the European Commission because there has to be done something on a European level. And if there will be such a call from the Commission, maybe the Ministry of Justice, or National Ministry of Justice, will feel encouraged to establish such a register and, of course, then to interconnect it through us. Well, I'll give you an example. We manage not only the ECS, but also the last wills. And in the case of the last wills, we don't have only notariates who are managing the registers. We also have partnerships with the countries, let's say Luxembourg, and it is managed by the local National Ministry of Justice. And they are part of our network, and we are working very well with them.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm glad to see that to hear there's already experience in that,
Yes.
interconnecting registers administered by different types of bodies and entities. Thank you very much. Andreas, may I give you the floor and ask you the following questions? The Commission has been obviously, maybe, listening to citizens who have been facing difficulties in cross-border successions. The succession regulation has been enforced in 7 years. We know in different areas of European law that when citizens face difficulties, they go to the European Commission. I don't know how they do it. Maybe they send you an old-fashioned letter. Maybe they send you an email. Maybe you get phone calls or citizens, knocking on your door. If that is the case, if you have been indeed receiving pleas and requests from citizens, can you give us maybe a brief overview of what are the critical issues on which citizens have, let's say, complaints about the succession regulation?
Yes, thanks, Patrick. Good afternoon to everyone. And first of all, thanks for the invitation to this event. It's a pleasure to be here. Before I come to the reply to the question, which I will not dodge, but I just wanted to say, because I haven't been able to take the floor before, that I'm very grateful for the presentation. Of course, we haven't seen the output, the final study yet, but what I've heard in this event and what I've seen in the recommendations and the executive summary is very promising. And will certainly be helpful for us as we move forward and eventually consider not only the evaluation, but then, who knows, maybe an amending process to the regulation. And what impresses me more than the legal thinking, because that I would have expected anyway, is the data part, which, Patrick, in your presentation, you also made a separate point, because we know how notoriously difficult it is in our field to gather data. When we do our own consultations, sometimes we struggle to get into the double-digit numbers of respondents because it's such a highly specialized area. And so I just wanted to say that I think one of the prime contributions, apart from the recommendations themselves, is the databases on which those recommendations are made, because hearing the number of participants, those are very high numbers in our area. So there is some sort of empirical weight, I would say, behind what you're doing. Now, on your question in relation to what's being brought to our attention, before we start the systematic evaluation process, when we do a study ourselves, which we'll probably do, but we certainly will build on what you have produced, there is no systematic process. So it's a bit more random, because someone complains to us or doesn't. Of course, we have fora where we exchange, not with citizens, but in the European Judicial Network, for example, where we have dedicated several meetings to the successions regulation, because it's obviously a practically very relevant instrument. And then we hear from contact points in the network, but of course they also consult the practitioners before they make these statements. And that's a reliable source. The citizen complaints, we do get a lot, but they're not a very reliable source, because the average European citizen has difficulties to distinguish between what we're responsible for and what we're not responsible for. And the finer points of private international law is something where I completely understand that this is sort of beyond the, the reflections of non-specialists. But, so I wouldn't say that we have a representative picture, which is why it's so important to get the input from you. But when I listen to the recommendations and the findings that give rise to those recommendations, there are certainly some issues that do not surprise me, because we know those issues from the EJN meetings, from complaints from other sources, sometimes preliminary rulings even. I mean, the land register issue is one that we have been painfully aware of for quite some time, and unfortunately we have received some clarification from the Court of Justice on what land registers are not obliged to do, but that doesn't solve the problem per se. So the question on how you make this work is still is still open. A couple of other issues have also been recurrent in what we hear. In complaints or otherwise, I mean, for example, the translation issues, the availability of information. So things along those lines are very much in line with what we hear, but some other issues have not been brought to our attention. So there were some surprises, the parallel proceedings issue, the register issue, some of the choice of law issues. Well, that's not necessarily a surprise because partly it was already discussed earlier, but this is something on which we will have to reflect afresh, but not on the basis of having been bombarded by complaints from citizens. So it's a mixed picture. I don't know if that's a satisfactory reply to your question.
Definitely is. Thank you very much. Also for the explanation on how the Commission works and how you gather information from different sources. I think that's also very enlightening, and I'm glad to hear that some of our findings echo let's say the own echo you receive from your own fields. Can I turn to you, Šárka? Maybe with the first question. The 18 recommendations are what they are. They will now, from today, live a life of their own. We'll see what the future brings to the project, and maybe some of the recommendations could one day lead to an amendment of the regulation, who knows? But in the meantime, as a notary, you have to face your clients, you have to help your clients, you have to assist your clients. And so the question is, taking stock of what we've all learned during the MAPE project, are there any proposals or elements you've learned from the exchanges we had during our meetings, which you could take on board to improve your practice today, that is to say, without waiting for an eventual amendment of the regulation? And Christiane, I will ask you the same question.
Right.
Bonjour à tous, merci de m'avoir invité. Ce que a été aujourd'hui dit déjà plusieurs fois, c'est qu'il faut utiliser des outils déjà existants. Alors, le plus important, je pense, c'est le réseau européen notarial, parce que quand moi, comme praticien, j'ai une succession internationale, il me faut avoir quelqu'un dans le pays où, par exemple, se trouve le bien immeuble pour obtenir des informations, mais aussi la coopération en ce qui concerne l'enregistrement dans le livre foncier, etc. Et moi, comme je suis actif dans le champ international, j'ai un réseau des amis privés auxquels je peux poser la question. Et je pense que pour des notaires ordinaires qui n'ont pas cette possibilité, je ne suis pas sûre s'ils utilisent beaucoup ces réseaux qui existent déjà. J'obtiens beaucoup de coups de téléphone des collègues qui me posent la question est-ce que j'ai eu un cas, je ne sais pas, envers Autriche, envers la France, comment ça a fonctionné, qu'est-ce que j'ai fait, comment j'ai fait. Donc il y a des outils déjà, mais peut-être qu'ils sont peu connus, ou bien qu'il faut répéter des informations, que ça existe, et comment ça fonctionne, et comment on doit l'utiliser. Et c'est aussi assez souvent que j'obtiens des questions des notaires des pays membres qui me posent les questions sur le droit tchèque, comment ça fonctionne, etc. Donc c'est là le point vraiment important de répéter les informations et les répéter au notaire. Et puis, il y a ce que Paolo Pascalis a déjà dit, il faut faire des entraînements, il faut avoir des cas pratiques. Parce que c'est aussi, ça me demande de notaire tchèque souvent, donnez-nous un guide avec des cas pratiques. Mais pas tous les cas sont les mêmes, donc c'est difficile de donner quelque chose parce que c'est pas la Bible. Hein. Donc, merci.
Merci beaucoup, Šárka. Et si je peux me permettre, peut-être pour peut-être continuer la discussion, de façon un petit peu provocatrice, on est en 2023, donc le règlement existe depuis un certain nombre d'années. Le réseau notarial européen, c'est les 10 ans, je crois on vient de fêter. Or, notre projet a montré que, en moyenne, c'est une moyenne, donc il y a des différences importantes entre États membres, mais quand même, la moyenne, elle est là. Seuls 17% des notaires interrogés ont déjà utilisé le réseau notarial européen. Alors, on a entendu le maître Pascalis, on vous a entendu, il faudrait que plus de notaires les utilisent, ces outils, dont le réseau notarial européen, dont on vous entend dire qu'effectivement, ils rendent des services très, très importants. Mais comment faire ? Comment faire pour les toucher ? Comment faire pour les convaincre, les notaires ? Est-ce qu'il y a... Vous n'avez pas de formule magique, mais est-ce l'une ou l'autre piste pourrait se dégager ? Est-ce qu'on doit travailler au niveau des chambres ? Est-ce que c'est individuellement ? Est-ce que vous avez des bonnes idées finalement pour que cet outil qui existe et qui a un certain coût, financé par la communauté, pour lequel le notariat a investi, et je crois l'Union européenne aussi, puisse finalement être utilisé par un plus grand nombre de notaires ?
Moi, je pense que les possibilités, il y en a. C'est avant que le règlement a entré en vigueur, il y avait des séminaires des notaires des pays voisins. J'y ai participé aussi, qui ont échangé les informations de leur pays, de leur registre foncier, de comment faire. Donc, c'est une possibilité. Et puis, bien sûr, au niveau des chambres, c'est ce qu'on fait. La chambre tchèque fait régulièrement les entraînements pour des notaires tchèques. Mais nous, on n'a pas un grand nombre de notaires. On est 450. Donc, c'est assez facile à réaliser. Merci.
Okay. Merci beaucoup, Šárka. Christian, maybe the same question. We're in 2023. There will be an evaluation of the regulation, possibly a recast, but this is for the long term. If we look at the situation now, how could you improve your practice and the practice of your colleagues, drawing from the MAPE project, the insights, the discussions we had, and possibly also the recommendations?
So thank you very much. I'm very proud to be part of the panel, part of the MAPE Successions project. And I have always, been a big fan of the succession regulation. I have been working here in Brussels during the time when the succession regulation came into force. I was part of the seminars we had, the cross-border seminars, the cross-border exchange we had before it all went into force. It came into force. So that was very, very helpful, and it was free of charge. So we also had a lot of participants, but just knowing how many notaries there are out in the EU, you can imagine that not everyone could take part. And that's something we see now in the study. What is also, you mentioned the many years that have gone by since it came into force. It might be helpful to have another series of such seminars with cross-border notaries taking part, exchanging their views, because with all the experience we have now, after almost 10 years, it might be even more helpful than before it came into force. I myself have been working as an interlocutor for the ENN. I have also been working for the German ministry as one of the contact points, helping in cross-border situations. And I'm still wondering how the outcome of the questionnaire is, with around 27% saying they have never applied the succession regulation. This is something from my daily practice in every single last will that is drafted by me. I have one sentence in it where I advise the parties about the succession regulation, the applicable law, and if they want to make a choice of law, and where they think they have their habitual residence. So in every single case, the succession regulation plays its role. And I have seen that in almost any notary offices in Germany. So I'm still wondering how these answers came together. And maybe a second round of questions could have helped to go a bit deeper and see where the actual problems lie for those people who have answered they have never applied the regulation. Another aspect of your question, what notaries can do, the Legalator, right now. Notaries have always been a very creative profession. So just looking at the German notariate, what kind of tools we use for people with handicap to draft a last will so that the state can't get the money, or for example, with lasting powers of attorney or living wills, that were all instruments invented by notaries. So now dealing with the succession regulation, we have already spoken about that case because there is no possibility to choose the court, to choose the forum, according to the succession regulation. We've been talking how we could manage to bring the heirs to the point where they need to bring the case to a court the testator wanted to. You can say the testator, he makes his last will depending, how do you say? It's a condition. It is a condition for the heirs, if they want to be the heir, that they bring the court to a certain, they bring the case to a certain court. If they decline to bring the case to this court, they are disinherited. So you may find solution for some of the problems by using the tools national law, national material law provides to, fill these gaps. However, of course, it would be more helpful if you have explicit rules on these topics. Choice of court would be a very, very helpful thing.
Well, thank you very much.
Je pense le même.
Oui.
Oui.
Vous pensez la même chose, mais sur le... Parce que ce qui est intéressant dans ce qui vient d'être dit, c'est notamment le fait que le notariat, confronté aux avantages du règlement, mais aussi, il faut bien le reconnaître, à ses limites, propose aux clients des solutions qui permettent d'aller plus loin. Et si je comprends bien la solution qui est proposée, qui est mentionnée ici, elle consiste à finalement indirectement imposer un choix de tribunal aux héritiers en insérant une espèce de clause pénale dans le testament. Est-ce que c'est ça qui vous paraît intéressant? Est-ce qu'en République tchèque, vous avez la même solution?
Non, moi, je pense, du point de vue de droit tchèque, cette condition ne sera pas valable.
Je pense que c'est une discussion qu'on pourrait avoir et on pourrait faire un exercice. On ne va pas le faire un exercice de droit comparé, mais je pense qu'il y a peut-être une minorité seulement d'États membres où une telle clause pénale serait acceptable. Dans un grand nombre d'États, et je parle pour la Belgique, c'est fort douteux qu'une telle clause pénale soit, enfin clause pénale ou en tout cas clause qui impose une obligation aux héritiers d'aller uniquement devant certains tribunaux sous peine de perdre le bénéfice de tout au parti de leur part successorale serait l'efficacité de la clause est douteuse. Mais le point essentiel, c'est que ça montre que le notariat est créatif pour trouver des solutions que n'offre pas aujourd'hui le règlement. Et vous, Christiane, je suis ravi que vous ayez terminé votre intervention en mentionnant la recommandation 7, effectivement, qui est une recommandation un petit peu disruptive, on peut le dire, où nous suggérons que le testateur ait la possibilité de choisir lui-même, ou plutôt d'accorder compétence aux tribunaux de l'État membre de sa nationalité. Can I come back, Andreas, to you? You've talked about the input you receive from different constituents, be it citizens or professionals through the EGN. You've sketched very briefly what could possibly be the future steps of a assessment evaluation recast. But drawing on what you've heard today, and I know you've not had the benefit of reading the full report, it will come, drawing on what you've heard today on the recommendations, is there any recommendation, any result which you would say, maybe off the record, I don't know, this seems interesting, or maybe on the contrary, this is an avenue where you think it's a no-go zone, you will not go as a commission?
Well, I think what I will not do and what I should not do is give you a kind of a knee-jerk reaction, because it's. I'll give you my personal views and I'll say a few things, but there's always a risk of, because no one's interested in my personal opinion, people will take this as an indication of what the Commission will or will not do. And I'm honestly not in the slightest position to give you any indication, because we're not only at the start of the process, we're not even at the start of the process. So all I can do is give you some sort of intuitive reaction to some of the points. And as I've said, well, first of all, out of the 18 recommendations, if you're in the limelight of expectations and attention, you're happy about every recommendation that is not addressed to you. And so not all the recommendations are addressed to the EU legislator, but most are, to be honest. And some of those that aren't may be addressed to us anyway, because the register issues that were mentioned, where I can give you no feeling at the moment, but what I can say in that respect is that there has been a tendency to legislate more on registers and their interconnection. We have even obliged member states to create registers where they don't exist yet in the insolvency field. So this is not completely outside the scope. I know the recommendation, what is it, 6 or 16, I don't know, 16 was addressed to the national legislator, essentially. Yeah. But this is nothing that sort of is completely removed from our sphere of attention, and we will be proposing legislation on the protection of adults, where probably registers will also play a role. So I'm mentioning it in that context. So this is something that there is certainly a tendency to pay more attention to that in EU legislation, maybe a tendency that didn't exist yet when we proposed and adopted the successions regulation, and we'll have a look at that on the basis of what you're providing us with, but then, of course, forming our own views as to whether or not that would be a good idea. There are some things, of course, in the recommendations, as I said, that echo observations that we have made or that have been brought to our attention anyway, on the ECS, on its simplicity, on the translation needs, and as I think is mentioned in the recommendation, we have worked on this in the Brussels 2B regulation, and of course this would be also a point of reference to ask ourselves, and this is not an unreasonable assumption, if this makes sense in the context of something that we've done very recently, so that sort of reflects state-of-the-art legislation in our view. Why shouldn't we also extend that to other instruments? Maybe to highlight very briefly 2 points on which I would just issue, not doubts or skepticism, but a question mark, at least. And that is the definition/guidance on cross-border and on habitual residence. And I don't say that I have a question mark in that respect, because I don't understand that it's not always crystal clear what is cross-border and what is habitual residence. Of course, there are hard cases, as for any legal text, and especially for inherently generic terms like those. It's difficult, but our experience shows that it's very difficult for the European legislator to intervene and provide clarity in that respect. And it's not for no reason that you won't find a definition of cross-border in most instruments. And where you find it, it's extremely restrictive, and maybe not in the interest of a dynamic application of the instrument to all the situations that have cross-border implications, in my view. So I think that's an issue that we have consciously chosen to leave to the development of case law basically, if ever there is a question, and we have a lot of case law on the Brussels I regulation, what this means, and involvement of third countries versus other member states, and so on and so forth. So this is, I think, a topic that's not easily regulated as such, and I would say the same thing about habitual residence, which I understand may cause more problems in this area than it does in other areas. But I think, and that's certainly a lesson to draw from the family law area, there are basically no two cases alike when it comes to habitual residence. So this is necessarily a case-by-case evaluation, and that's what we see in every Court of Justice ruling on the Brussels IIb regulation as to where, for example, a child has its habitual residence. And yes, one can add something to a recital. Yes, one can produce a practice guide, but there are issues where I don't see any easy solution from the perspective of sort of legislating clarity into the text and into the concept.
Well, thank you very much. And the caveats you made before answering the questions, they're obviously well taken. We understand your position, and you announced an intuitive answer. It was more than an intuitive answer. Thank you very much for your very forthcoming answer on all these issues. And without disclosing the content of all our discussions, the working group, different working groups, scientific and other committees which took part in elaborating the recommendations, in these groups, everybody was well aware of the fact that calling for more guidance on habitual residence, on scope of application, is a two-edged sword. It could provide more clarity, but it could also close a little bit the concept and make it less flexible, thereby losing some of its advantage. And somehow, some of the recommendations may be taken more as a signal that there is an issue, there is a problem in the practice. We flag out the issue, we flag out the problem, we suggest a solution, but definitely there may be other solutions to that problem to close the gap between the reality of practice and what the regulation may offer. We have people online, though we don't see them here, and they can react also to the discussion by asking questions using the same method, Slido, which has been used in the first panel. So I suggest that we call for them to shoot questions, and I see there's already one question. Maybe we can take it immediately. Are the creation and/or interconnection of a new national registers of wills or ECS planned or envisaged via the European network? Octavian, I'm sorry, but it's for you.
Yeah, I'm just taking the microphone. Well, what can I say? It doesn't depend on ARERT, I'll say the French version, the creation of new national registers. It's purely on the national level or the national will, political will, let's say from the authorities or for the national notariates. That's why I'm strongly asking for those notariates who doesn't have such a register to establish one. And then, of course, it's easier to interconnect them on the technical way. But to interconnect them, first we have to have them. So please do it. But I would, if I may say something else, ex-ARERT. What if we take the experience from, let's say, Deutsches Notarinstitut about those issues on the regulation and or from the Austrians or anyway, and bring them on a common platform. So, I mean, one testing for the practitioner, legal practitioner. So when you have an issue, then you can take a look and have a possible solution for your practical case. I don't know, it's just an idea.
And kind of frequently ask questions.
Yeah, let's say it like this.
Well, thank you very much. For those of you who don't know, CNUE is also involved in a parallel project on training. It's called ELAN. And one of the main outcome of that project will be an online e-training platform, which will include, among other, also some modules on the succession regulation. Octavian, there won't be yet in that model an account of all the practical experience of all national chambers, but who knows?
No, it was just wishful thinking.
So that's how big ideas are made. First, you start by dreaming. A very practical question from the field: is the ENN open to candidate notaries and staff? I think it may be a good question, because maybe some candidate notaries hesitate. Can I join? Can I not join? Anybody knows the answer? I don't.
Yes. It is open to candidate notaries, because you need to apply, and then your account is, it's opened. So even if you're not a notary, it works. You just need to apply.
So it's open to candidate notaries, but what about staff members working for a notary but not being a candidate notary?
They use the account of the notary.
Okay, so the answer is they may not have an individual account, but they may use the account of the notary they work for. Thank you very much for this clarification. So it means...
We have practical answers.
Okay, it's a practical answer to a practical problem. I hope this answers the question which was asked by one of the participants. Can I follow up with a question from the floor, from the audience?
Yeah.
Yes?
Thank you. Yeah, well, I work with Andreas in the Commission. Thank you so much for this study you've made. The recommendations are super useful for us, for our work. And I'm very impressed by the amount and the quality of the work, although I've just seen what is now available. If I may, please bear with my ignorance. It's just we need to understand why sometimes you ask for things. The Commission, this request for having national ECS registers and interconnection has been on our table for a long time. It's a demand that we've heard for a while. But internally, we had the impression that given that the ECS can only be issued by an authority that has jurisdiction under the regulation, at least theoretically, from the point of view of the regulation, there should not be parallel proceedings or, parallel issuances. And if there are, that there should be a way to... Well, there shouldn't be. Of course, the whole issue sometimes lies on the definition of habitual residence, of course. But leaving these factual considerations aside, so because there are jurisdiction rules, why would it be so necessary for there to be a register of ECSs? Where does the need arise? Arguably, from an international viewpoint, there shouldn't be. And so I'm wondering whether is it also at national level that this can happen? That's because in one member state, several notaries would have the jurisdiction if they are approached by different heirs. So is it a problem at national level mainly, or is it also between member states? So just to understand the need, really, because for us, we didn't really grasp this need. And then, if I may ask...
Please.
The choice of court, aren't the possibilities already under the regulation enough? Why would the heirs may be all over the world, right? From Australia to Finland to the habitual residence of the testator. Why would you impose that burden, leaving aside the sanctions, which that obviously, it would be a bit radical, but what would be the advantage added, given that we already have some flexibility in the regulation? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So these are questions on recommendation number 15 first, but tied to the parallel proceedings, and maybe I'll let Octavian and Šárka answer.
Very sure.
And the second question on choice of court, maybe Christian, you can comment on that, Octavian?
Well, starting with the, let's say, avoiding parallel procedures. Yes, if you read the regulation, it would be quite obvious not to have parallel procedures, but it happens anyway. Errors occur, and we have somehow to avoid them. I think let's say at least for the Romanian example, we have to avoid parallel procedures not on the national level, but on the European level. I'll give an example with Hungary, because we have a lot of Hungarian minorities in Romania, and there are also Romanians in Hungary. And if a Romanian dies in Hungary, well, the succession will be somehow ruled by a Hungarian notary, and if the deceased has some immovables in Romania, then he has to include them maybe in a hypothetical European certificate of successions. But the same thing can occur in Romania, because the same succession case can be, partially at least, be solved in Romania. So avoiding parallel procedures, if you have a national register of ECS in Hungary, the Romanian notary, before he starts his procedure, can take a look through ARERT on this network, and to see if there was another ECS issued in Hungary for his deceased. I don't know if I'm very clear. Yes, it should be. I started that by saying that errors can occur, and then everyone can take the responsibility, let's say, to attract its competence to issue the ECS.
But thank you very much, Octavian. I think the problem is a bit broader. Mais Šárka, est-ce que je peux vous demander de... Parce que, comme je crois que je l'ai mentionné, là où les résultats ont montré qu'il y a finalement une forte prévalence de procédures parallèles, c'est dans certains pays, c'est l'Autriche, la Croatie, la République tchèque, la Hongrie et la Slovaquie, où on est au minimum à 60% des notaires qui ont déjà été confrontés à ce problème. Et je pense que ça montre que une des racines du problème, c'est en réalité la façon dont les notaires sont saisis, qui est différente. Et Šárka, est-ce que je peux vous laisser la parole sur ce point-là?
Oui, alors en Tchéquie, il n'y a pas de problème sur le niveau national, parce qu'il y a un critère fixe, c'est la procédure successorale commence ex officio, c'est la matrice qui envoie l'acte de décès au tribunal au lieu de l'adresse enregistrée dans la carte d'identité. Donc, il y a un seul notaire, un seul tribunal qui peut commencer la procédure. Mais au niveau entre les États membres, comme il y a un critère de la résidence habituelle, qui est un critère très moderne et très juste, il peut arriver qu'il y a dans chaque pays, dans un pays membre et dans un autre pays membre, le notaire qui est demandé d'ouvrir la procédure parce que le défunt avait sa résidence habituelle dans l'État, mais la même chose peut être dite à un autre notaire dans un autre État membre. Et lorsque, je ne sais pas si c'est peut-être quelqu'un qui vit 6 mois en Espagne et puis, je ne sais pas, 6 mois en République tchèque, ça peut parvenir, et c'est à cause de ce critère. Et c'est aussi la raison pourquoi, peut-être, c'est un tel problème, pourquoi on demande d'avoir une définition pour que ça soit sûr. Mais c'est clair que une définition pourrait être trop restrictive, que ça pourra même fermer des portes. Hein.
Oui, merci beaucoup Šárka. Mais pour embrayer, pour compléter, je crois qu'il faut... Ce que l'étude a montré, c'est que le problème des procédures parallèles, il dépasse le problème des certificats successoraux européens. En réalité, c'est un problème qui est plus large. On a des procédures parallèles qui sont ouvertes dans 2 États membres, où effectivement, dans un État membre, il y aura une compétence pour délivrer un certificat parce qu'il y aura une résidence habituelle, et donc le notaire ou l'autorité aura vérifié sa compétence. Et dans l'autre État membre, on a un notaire qui est saisi par des proches du défunt, mais qui n'est pas saisi pour délivrer un certificat successoral européen, qui est saisi pour, en général, régler la succession, et qui ne doit pas vérifier sa compétence. Et donc là, on a, de façon parallèle, des notaires dans 2 États membres qui vont travailler sur le même dossier, ce qui représente quand même si on regarde les 2 ensemble, de façon systémique, c'est un gaspillage de ressources, et potentiellement, c'est la source de contradiction si jamais les deux notaires, dans un cas, délivrent un certificat successoral, dans l'autre, délivre un acte de partage et on a des documents contradictoires. Mais ce n'est pas simplement le fait que des documents contradictoires puissent arriver qui est problématique, c'est la saisine concurrente de deux notaires différents qui est problématique et qui tient, encore une fois, qui dépasse largement la question du certificat, qui tient à la façon dont les notaires sont saisis. Et là, c'est indépassable. Hein, c'est indépassable. Il n'appartient pas à l'Union européenne de proposer aux États membres de réformer la façon dont les notaires sont saisis. Ça, je crois qu'on est bien d'accord là-dessus. Donc, il faut trouver d'autres solutions. La recommandation numéro, je crois que c'est la 7, c'est la 8, c'est la 7, je ne sais plus, 7, propose quelque chose qui est une tentative. Non, c'est la 6, excuse-moi. 6, c'est la 6, qui est une tentative, mais au moins son mérite, c'est de signaler que le problème existe. You had another question on choice of court. Why do we need to have a choice of court? Can I ask you to comment on that?
Of course, thank you. Well, one of the main objectives of the succession regulation was to have unified rules, saying the court that has jurisdiction should rule with its own national law. So the concept of habitual residence pointed straight towards that direction. However, if we have ever dealt with a community of heirs, they often are not of the same opinion. And sometimes in cross-border cases, they also live in different states. So you may have one situation where not all the heirs want to have the same court. In this case, Article 5 is not an option. And it is also a bit disputed if, for example, people who have mandatory shares need to be involved. Because if you have them involved, it will be even worse. They will do anything to obstruct the whole procedure. Then it is not a must for the court. I mean, you can do it as the heirs with the prorogation, but still if the court decides to take on the case, it will rule about that case. And it depends which state you want to have. It can be a more or less lengthy process. In some countries, it might be a very, very long dispute, whereas in other states, a court decision can be reached within a few weeks or months. So we don't want the heirs to use their choice of court as a weapon against the other heirs. That would be one of the objects. And of course, it is more legal security for the testator if he has the possibility to choose according to his law that he wants to be applied, also the court.
Thank you, Christian. In the meantime, we've received some questions online, and we need to be mindful of the clock because we're already over time. This last question, which is on the screen, I think it's fairly easy to answer. I think the answer is no. As far as I understand, the European Notarial Network cannot be opened to notaries or other professionals from third countries because they're just not members of the EU. So unless there's a bridge made with another institution, and that would be, in terms of infrastructure, institutionally speaking, quite a difficult endeavor. At the moment, I think, no, it's just, and I don't think it's on the table, unless I'm wrong. There were previous questions on recommendation number 18, which you may have seen. In the meantime, they've disappeared from the screen. Recommendation 18, the question on what, from the questions, I could sense a bit of frustration with recommendation 18. Is that it? Is that the only thing you suggest in recommendation 18? Can you now be bolder and suggest something which is more notarial friendly? I think indeed to some extent it's a little bit timid what we suggest in recommendation 18. But one thing is certain. The case decided last week by the Court of Justice has shown that the regulation is ambitious, but it has only ambition, and it can only have ambition within succession matters. As soon as you touch issues which are strictly linked to real estate and real estate register, the regulation is powerless. And that is something the regulation cannot bridge. So you cannot imagine a solution out of the regulation which would solve all problem, a miraculous solution which would solve all problem of access to land register. If there's one thing that this Register Central case has made clear is that we will need to work in the future going back and forth between notaries from member state A to notaries member state B, and in parallel having discussion with the land registers in the two member states, or definitely in the member state where the real estate is located, to provide maybe a checklist of information, additional information which needs to be added to the European Certificate of Succession. So there's no easy way out of that, but it's just simply because of the fact that the succession regulation is not meant to interfere in the way member states regulate their land registers. I don't know if any one of you has a better answer to those two questions. Andreas?
Well, I mean, first of all, we share the sense of frustration because there is an important issue that occupies a central role in many succession cases, where we wanted to do away with problems in cross-border cases, and the way this is handled in practice, there is no solution. So we're in a limbo situation in that respect, and the court case, of course, looked at one of the possible ways to resolve this, and that's from the registrar's side, saying that you just have to sort of disregard your own legal requirements as soon as you're confronted with an ECS, and there you've correctly said this is not an option. So that leaves two issues. Either member states have to consider whether they change their law, and I've heard that as a demand. We've discussed this in EJN meetings where, and I think there was even an example, I can't remember which.
Czech Republic did.
Yes, they changed the legislation on registers in order to accommodate these cases. But to us, essentially that's a suboptimal way out. Of course, it would be much more helpful if the ECS obliged the itemization of those assets. And that's a question that the court has mentioned. I just read the decision in preparation for this. I hadn't read it before, but there is a paragraph 39 that says, in order to assess whether the obligation to include in the ECS a list of assets and so on and so forth, and then you have to do the following, but then they don't assess that question anymore. So they ask a question and they don't reply to it, and so to us that is still open, and so it's open to interpretation. And it would have been nice to have that resolved in a preliminary ruling case. The court didn't. So maybe at some point, because this occurs quite often in practice, you will get another referral to the court. I would expect that to happen if nothing else happens. And if it doesn't, or if it is replied to in a way that also doesn't solve the problem, well then of course this is also a question for the review process, where we cannot change registration law, but we can consider the regulation.
Thank you very much. Christian, maybe a last comment on that, because then we have to conclude.
There would be one more option to find a solution to that case, which is open jurisdiction for national certificates of succession. So you can say in that state where you need these, special listings of the single, pieces of land, then you could also go to a court in that country and get a national ECS just for the assets that belong to that country. That is something that was obstructed by the Oberle case of the ECJ, because in Germany we had the possibility to have also in our jurisdiction a German, national certificate of succession.
Okay. Yes, there are other solutions, but I think we really have to conclude because mindful of the time, we've only started the debate, and I'm sorry to create some frustration. I have myself frustrations. You have to know I have 6 other questions I would have liked to ask the panelists, but mindful of the time, I would, on your behalf, thank the members of the panel very much for their comments and interventions, and give the floor to Marianne Sevindik for the final conclusion of this afternoon's conference. Thank you very much again.
Thank you.